Slijedi Masterclass. Danas ćemo čuti više o evoluciji crnogorskog platnog sistema i značaju istog za banke i preduzeća. U ovu temu uvešće nas dr. Zorica Kalezić, viceguvernerka Centralne banke Crne Gore. Ona će najaviti svog gosta. Ovaj panel biće na engleskom jeziku, pa ukoliko je nekome potrebno može da uzme slušalice na stolu su. Hvala vam.
It's my distinguished pleasure to be the part of today's conference. Only 2 years ago, I was present on the same scene, presenting at the first conference, talking about SEPA integration very cautiously with my dear peers from the region. We had big dreams to become a member of SEPA, but our targets were far away, 2028, maybe 2030. And look at us now. 3 years from that date, we are 21 days shy of the first SEPA transaction. We made it. In that regard, I will use this opportunity to extend my sincere appreciation to all 11 banks, which will be starting October 6th, become the members of integrated SEPA market in operational terms. My special thanks goes to especially all 66 members of the SEPA task force teams from 11 banks, which had the very difficult who had a very difficult role to implement SEPA into their streams and to make the ownership of the process. This process entailed more than 245 reports from 11 banks in the course of 10 months, more than 100 joint meetings, 5 workshops with our distinguished trusted advisor, Mr. Kjeld Herreman, co-founder of Paylume, who was there with us to help us to overcome each and every operational or strategic glitch that would potentially enable us to integrate into SEPA. Once more, congratulations. We did an outstanding job as a team, but I would highlight that SEPA is just a particle. It is the part of the puzzle that we are gathering in enhancing our payment landscape. And here us today, our major role will be to highlight where we stand when it comes to development of our payment system, both domestically and internationally. In that regard, once more, I want to introduce you to Mr. Herreman, who have been our trusted advisor during SEPA integration process, now will be our trusted advisor under the implementation of TIPS clone, and as of yesterday, representing us before EPC and fighting for the rights and interests of Montenegrin banks in Brussels. So I really invite you to just give applause to Mr. Herreman.
Thank you very much.
Our first idea is just to have 2 separate presentations where I would give some kind of a general strategic overview as a deputy governor, where Mr. Herreman would go into nitty-gritty details on the, I would say, operational aspects that our banks needs to overcome in order to become, I would say, interoperable with European payment infrastructures. However, at the end, we came to the idea it is the best to merge our presentations because we did the whole road on SEPA integration together. We are heading toward TIPS together. So what is where I believe that the best message is to present you with the changes in our payment landscape together, given that he is very much acquainted with the adjustment in our payment system. So in that aspect, I will start with the first slide, where we stand, what us as a regulator were thinking when we embarked on change of our payment system landscape. We are very much aware of the fact that payments standing still means falling behind, i.e. us, as a very, very small economy, we cannot afford to stay still. We need to be agile, we need to be ahead of the curve, we need to run as Alice in the Wonderland. It takes all the running that we can do to stay in the same place. And that is precisely where we are. However, even to be in this position where today we are faced with the fact that more than 100 jurisdictions already have fast instant payment incorporated in their payment landscape, we needed to, I would say, finalize three very, very important building blocks together with banks. The first one was legal alignment, EU acquis alignment, namely, in order to create EU interoperable infrastructures, we needed to underpin it with European standards. Together, we did that as of February 2025, where we fully implemented PSD2 together with bylaws. Our second building block is the one where we are at the moment. On international front, we are joining SEPA. On domestic front, we are developing TIPS clone. Overlay services reflects our third layer, which is very, very important because it highlights the very essence of the changes within the payment system, reachability. We don't want development of the payment infrastructure without the purpose. There is enormous gap in the usage of the payment infrastructures in Montenegro, and it is our joint task to fill that gap. Where we started when it comes to SEPA transfers, I think that for the sake of transparency, we as a regulator really need to showcase where we were. And I think that it is no secret that our SWIFT transfers to SEPA markets were extremely high, especially for corporates. Look at the figures for sending outbound transactions above 20,000. It reaches almost 240 euros. Average fee for outbound SEPA transfer via SWIFT in 2024 was at the level of 73.4 euros. In addition to that, the latest research done by the World Bank from the August of this year consider Montenegro to be the most expensive B2B corridor, not only among Western Balkan countries, but of course, consequently, in Europe as well. Figures are staggering. For a transfer of 5,000 euros within the Western Balkan region, Montenegrin corporate sector needs to pay around 0.9% of the value that they are sending. Corridors level within the Western Balkans are the most expensive between Montenegro and North Macedonia. In order to send 20,000 euros, the corporate sector would need to pay 1.1% of the value of the transactions. So this is staggeringly more than 20 times more what is the European standard. I will now leave this slide to Mr. Herreman to present his views on where we stand at the moment or where we were standing when it comes to dynamics of our payment transactions.
Thank you. So what did I want to show with this slide? It is the number of transactions that we are doing in Montenegro per capita compared to EU standards, right? You mentioned the high prices that we've seen the data from the World Bank for, whether we don't have a lot of transactions due to high prices, or whether we have high prices due to a lack of volumes. We can interpret it either way. But what do we see? In any case, in Montenegro, if we compare it to the Eurozone averages, we're only doing about half the transactions as the average Eurozone countries. And if we go to markets that are even further developed when it comes to digital payments, I'll look at, for example, the Netherlands, Finland, we're not even at a fifth of those type of volumes. So there's definitely a lot of room for growth in the markets and a lot of potential to improve the experience for Montenegrin payment service users. And that growth becomes even more prominent when we zoom into the figures. Here, if we're actually looking at the transfers that are being currently done in Montenegro, we see that this whole big block in blue are book-to-book transfers. People have organized their lives to be able to do banking within the same bank as their employers, as their family, and so on and so forth, because the costs for book-to-book transfers are much lower, right? So we see book-to-book transfers much higher than in other European markets. And then if we look at the interbank credit transfers, so that would be the green portion of this pie, we see that about a third of those interbank credit transfers are related to public sector payments, which means that the pure private sector interbank credit transfers is only basically a quarter of the payments that are being done in Montenegro, which are again only half of the EU averages. Right? One of the reasons for that might be the lack or slow digitalization that's taking place in the market.
Yes, indeed. One of, I would say, lackluster features of the Montenegrin market is that we are faced with underutilization of the digital channels within the banking system by the corporate sector. Today, we listened about implementation of the IE in e-commerce, etc. However, I believe that we need to go back to the basics. As you may observe in the research that we have provided, we can already see quite clearly that the corporate sector is not using available digital channels. In today's world, this is unacceptable. Just to mention, there are, for example, situations that in large banks, only 3% of the corporate sector who have actively opened account who are using combined both m-banking and internet banking. This enormous asymmetric information and asymmetric gap existing between corporate sector and banking sector is worrisome, whether it's due to lackluster and deficient financial education, existing, I would say, practices and proclivity for cash payments, or I would say underdeveloped ERM models within the corporate sector. It is yet to be seen. This slide will be a very, very core of our attention in the future.
Absolutely, and maybe to give a perspective from my personal life, we were having this conversation yesterday. I have been to the bank twice in the last 10 years. Once last year when I was opening an account for Paylume for business. They still wanted to do the KYC in person for business because it was a new bank as well. And the second time when I was signing my mortgage for my house. Those are the only 2 times in the past 10 years I've been to my bank. I've gotten a car loan through my banking app. Basically all my banking activities, I can do it online. And we see that in a lot of European markets, right, where digital banking is starting to become the norm. We start to see branch networks start to become a little bit smaller, and we see that costs come down as well, because obviously servicing clients digitally has a big cost advantage as well. So I think as we integrate into the EU, we will see more and more of this. The last thing that I might mention on digital banking that I think will impact the Montenegrin market is we are now starting to become integrated into SEPA, meaning that you can do more and more of your banking with a bank that's potentially not even based in Montenegro, right? There's still some restrictions, but for your daily banking activities, you can even start to consider banks within the SEPA region now that costs have gone down. So I think it's only a matter of time before digital only or digital first banks start to enter the market. And what we've seen throughout Europe is that puts downwards pressure on prices across the banking sector. This, I would say, is probably the biggest challenge for Montenegro. Right? Payments are subject to economies of scale. If you think about all these projects that we're doing, the SEPA integration, all of these type of things, they're projects with high costs, high fixed costs, and whether you do 1 transaction or you do 1 billion, those fixed costs are still there. Meaning that markets that have these economies of scale actually have a lot of pricing benefits as well, and they are still able to operate at a margin even though they have very low revenues. Now I think this is one of the key benefits of SEPA and that European integration as well. You no longer need vendors that need to make bespoke solutions for Montenegrin practices, for the way that Montenegrin banking works, right? We can be standardized more into European standards when it comes to digital banking, when it comes to the packages. We have access to cheaper solutions across the world, thereby driving down the costs. So there will be pressure on prices to come down when it comes to transaction banking. And even there, to give another anecdote, in those 10 years I was talking about, I've never paid for a payment. Literally never. My bank does not charge me anything, zero, for a SEPA transaction, whether that's as private individual or as business.
So in that aspect, in relation to the digitalization of the corporate sector, if that is okay to run the first call. Yes, do you believe Montenegro companies and citizens will shift quickly to digital channels for SEPA payments, or will habits change more slowly?
Interesting. It seems to be really spread across the board for now.
Yes.
Interesting. So we see that the two options that are slightly more selected here is that it'll take 2-3 years. And that is what we generally see with market practices, right? Because even if a user experience is arguably better or if prices are cheaper, it takes time for habits to evolve. To give another anecdote, we saw this, for example, with contactless payments. We've had contactless payments on cards that were existing for a while, arguably a better user experience than PIN and chip. However, only really started to take off when we had this catalyst of the COVID-19 virus that people really didn't want to touch the terminal anymore. So user habits take a while to change. Yeah. And then interesting on businesses as well. What are your views on this?
Yes. So overall, it appears really that the most voters, participants in the conference, are in favor of the opinion that gradual approach will take place instead of, I would say, rapid adoption. And I have to admit, my personal view is a very similar one, although we as a regulator do as much as we can to expedite this process.
Thank you. Shall we go back to the presentation?
Yes, just go back to the presentation.
All right. So now that we understand a little bit of the context of the Montenegrin payments market, let's dive into some of the things that are happening, the evolutions that are happening. And in my 15 years in payments, I've never seen a market moving as quickly as the Montenegrin market. So I can only echo what the Vice Governor has said. My congratulations to everyone for keeping up to speed with this. So what are the 4 areas that we'll be looking at this afternoon? Well, first of all, we'll look at the integration of SEPA and what it means for banks, what it means for businesses, the adoption of the ISO 20022 messaging standard. We'll talk about some of the changes to the domestic payment system, so to our DNS and RTGS systems. And then we'll end with the hot topic of the moment, TIPS clone and the adoption of instant payments in the Western Balkans. So starting with SEPA and regulatory alignment. In Europe, or within the EU at least, banks are facing regulation. If you look at IT budgets in banks, 80% of that budget is going to complying with regulation. The speed of change is ever increasing. And here we have, a list of some of the payments regulation that we have, and that's just payments regulation. Next to that, you have AML regulation, you have data privacy regulation, you have resilience regulations, DORA, right? So this is a lot of time and effort that's put into complying with these regulations. Most of the regulation in EU, I think it would be fair to say, is driven out of the protection of the consumer, protection of businesses. I think that's the underlying theme in European regulation. Would you agree with that?
Yes,
Yeah.
Yes, of course.
And obviously we've done some work already in applying that here.
Yes, I believe that we all together with the banks, we implemented everything what was our, I would say, homework under the Chapter 4 Free Flow Capital. When it comes to payment system, we fully adopted amendments to the payment system law, incorporating PSD2, of course, with stronger customer authentication, secure communication in place in all 11 banks. Of course, one of our very, very important tasks was to adjust our AML CFT framework. You're very much aware that Montenegro is one of those rare countries that have never been grey listed by Manival. So for us, the stake was very, very high in that regard. Being the part of SEPA is an additional, I would say, burden, and from the perspective of reputational stake, and that aspect, apart from implementing a new AML law, which incorporated the recommendations from Manival, FATFA, and OECD, as well regulation on transfer of funds and crypto. We would say that in terms of implementation, we've done quite a bit in, I would say, to preserve the image of a pristine destination when it comes to AML issues. When it comes to banking regulation, as you could hear from today's speech of the governor, that in the course of 9 months, we introduced 16 pieces of legislation, ending in a closure of, I would say, our requirements within the remit of Chapter 9 financial services. And just to maybe tilt to my dear colleagues from the banking sector, new law on commercial bank, a new law on credit institutions, incorporating CRD6 is just around the corner, will be adopted by the Council by end of September of this year. So strategic outcome is that at the moment, in terms of payments, banking, AML, Central Bank of Montenegro and Montenegrin banking system are fully aligned with the EU acquis.
Perfect. And just to take a small detour on PSD2, right? Many of the banks have spent considerable time and effort implementing PSD2, but there are some good business cases for this as well, right? Here we can see an example of a checkout that can be done using open banking, where we're using payment initiation followed by a credit transfer. And I think some of the changes on the DNS systems, where we have much faster payments, will allow these type of user experiences. Other types of use cases that we've seen in Europe is the use of account aggregation. So to get payments data from other financial institutions to be able to better do risk scoring, for example, when applying for a credit card or a personal loan, these type of things. But finally, I think the big change that we've seen in Europe, and this is linking it back to that digital banking, is that, well, you know, if I go back before PSD2, my bank app wasn't all that great. I couldn't get mortgages. I could just do my basic daily banking on there, but not much more. And it's when PSD2 came about and banks said, hold on, if we don't improve our user experience and have a better integrated service on that digital platform, well then fintechs will come in, and it'll be fintechs that have the user experience, and we'll just provide the plumbing, provide the rails in the back. So what we saw with PSD2, it's not just the use of the APIs under PSD2 that had a big impact, but it's mainly the reaction of banks to try to make sure that that user experience stood out and was better than the user experience of potential fintechs. So I hope that, you know, with PSD2, we'll see that accelerate the user experience on banking apps here as well. So SEPA, what's the idea behind SEPA? Is that clients can make seamless cashless euro payments across the union. We have an integrated market. We want to have integrated payments, because payments, again, are the plumbing to the economy. Obviously, we've now extended that with the Western Balkans, with Montenegro being the first country, or one of the first countries to be accepted. I can say as well, in Brussels, there are always very positive echoes about Montenegro as well, both from the private and the public sector. Obviously, the European Payments Council, the payments people understand what it is, but maybe the non-payments people don't. So the European Payments Council is actually owned by financial institutions. It's owned by the banks. It's a consortium, and they define the European payment schemes. So SEPA is developed and maintained by the European Payments Council. with this integration into SEPA, it allows banks in Montenegro to not only participate in the SEPA credit transfer scheme, which is what's now going live on October 7th, but it also allows banks to participate in other EPC schemes, such as SEPA Direct Debit or SEPA Instant Payments, and to make use of these pan-European schemes. So hopefully banks will start to make use of that as well. This is the date that we're looking for, right?
Yeah. Yes, I think that we all wait for October the 7th when our banks will start with first SEPA transactions. In that regard, as you may already know, Central Bank of Montenegro, in line with the Article 59 of the law on payments, imposed caps, upper caps on SEPA transactions, namely from voluntary fee schemes that we got from the banks. For SEPA transactions, we were dissatisfied, I have to be very transparent, compared to what we expected given what are the principles of SEPA, affordability and reachability being the most important. So in that aspect, Central Bank of Montenegro reacted by capping SEPA transaction fees, where first daily transfer for natural persons, i.e. physical persons, up to 200 euros is only 0.02 euros, i.e. 2 cents. And I'm grateful that all banks decided for this type of transaction to be lowered to 0. So what we wanted is really to push retail payments and to give, I would say, a boost and a feeling to, I would say, local corporate sector, and in this case, physical persons, natural persons, that they are the part of Europe, because those are the fees that you can find within European Union. For, as you may see, instead of, I would say, making a usual division between corporate and physical persons, what we have done, we made the division between usage of electronic transactions compared to cash deposits in bank branches. So for all transactions up to 20,000 euros, electronic transactions cannot be higher than 199 euros, and almost 2 euros, 1.99, i.e. 3.99 if we are talking about cash deposits in the banking branch. And for transactions above 20,000 euros, the spread is 25 euros for electronic payments and 50 euros for cash deposits. In that aspect, at the moment, we have a rather unified picture of the fees across the banks. All of them more or less opted to follow our caps, but we are hoping with the, I would say, integration of new players and fintechs that are just about to come to our market, that definitely this will stir a bit more competition. But even now, with these caps, this is very, very similar to something that can be expected within, I would say, some smaller countries within the European Union. And as a consequence, annual savings to the corporate sector, i.e. decline in the revenues of the banks, is expected at the level of almost 14 million euros, i.e. 23.5%. Meaning that the banks would need to change their business models. Reliance on SWIFT and old business habits is just not reality. We are entering in the field of, I would say, international competition, and my general advice to banks is to act sooner rather than later.
Absolutely. And whether it's through the swift hand of the regulator, or whether it's the slower, invisible hand of the free markets and competition, you can anticipate that for transactions, both SEPA as well as domestic, those fees will come down, right? Payments throughout many of the European markets have become commoditized, which has led banks to start to develop new products that are based around the data in payments for their banks. Products like cash forecasting, better profiling your clients to know when to offer loans business to them, right? So the payments business by itself is no longer very profitable in Europe. So banks have had to rethink, as you said, their business models. So I anticipate that we'll see some of that happening in Montenegro as well. Quick talk about ISO 20022, right? And it's not just the messaging standard that is used for SEPA payments, but also when it comes to cross-border payments, we now use ISO 2002 for SWIFT payments, and our domestic market infrastructures have also adopted the ISO 20022 norm. You know, what are some of the benefits? Well, it's a more modern, it's a more structured, it's a richer language, which will allow for higher straight-through processing rates, because more structured, more data allows you to automate more within your payments, right? So that's the big benefit. We have a standardized messaging language, still some variants that are happening, but standardized messaging language that allows for a lot of automation. Also, when it comes to compliance monitoring, we can anticipate to have more data about transactions, or more structured data about transactions, which has a big benefit that there's less transactions that we have to manually review from an AML perspective. Structured data, one of the key things that's coming up, and that's coming up for 2016, is that we will need to introduce structured address data when we do payments, right? For any cross-border payments, we will need structured address data. And there's actually a treasury consulting firm called Zandix that did a study with these very large corporates, but where they looked at these corporates to see what it would cost these corporates to actually implement structured addresses. And for each of these corporates, the cost turned out to be around €500,000. So it's important to think of this not only as a banking project, but corporates are also impacted. They will need to provide the structured data to their banks, and many of them today do not yet have that capability. Certainly, if we're also looking at kind of the data transmission methods, where a lot of corporates are doing that semi-manually and whatnot. So this is something that impacts not only banks, but also corporates. The other big change, so here we see an example of a structured address, and we have these addresses that will become mandatory as of the 22nd of November of 26. We will no longer be able to use unstructured addresses. We also have additional structured data that will be required by at latest 2030. So the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, has updated Recommendation 16, which is regarding payments and the travel rule. And for any transactions above €1,000 that are related to businesses, we will need to apply a legal entity identifier. So that means businesses in Montenegro will need to apply for legal entity identifiers to register their legal entities. Banks will need to capture that data and transmit it. The benefit is that it more uniquely defines a business, and through this LEI and public APIs, we can retrieve all the ultimate parents, children of the company, and so forth, and so on. So it's a lot easier to do this from a compliance perspective. I think LEI usage in Montenegro is probably still quite low as it is throughout Europe. So this will be a significant impact. The target of FATF is to have fully implemented this by 2030. So that'll trickle down, I assume, into European legislation, and then from European legislation, it will go forward into Montenegrin legislation. Now here's your chapter, domestic payments modernization. What's happened there?
Yes, so, well, in that aspect, I believe that representatives of the banks are very much acquainted on the changes that has happened within Montenegrin payment system in recent months. Starting May 26th, we implemented an upgraded version of our payment system, again, still relying on RTGS and DNS, but of course with additional features in terms of the online clearing, which assures, I would say, faster disposability of the funds to final clients. Our next, I would say, step was to extend the number of working hours of our payment system, because given that our end goal is tips clone 24/7, we opted to have this, I would say, gradual approach in extended the number of hours. As of 20th of October, you probably have already heard, our payment system will be working over the weekends and national holidays. That would mean 118 additional working days of our payment system, around 32 million of savings within the corporate sector, and I would say adjustment in the speed of our payments by more than 10 hours. So the corporate sector and I would say general clients in Montenegro are getting better, faster service in payments at the same price. And how fast we are moving, one can tell from this table. In a matter of few months, I would say we made, together with the banks, a very, very important strides. As I said, first we introduced RTS-X, new version of our payment system, who is working in real time from the online clearing perspective. Then we adjusted the tariffs for DNS and RTGS messages after 14 hours. It doesn't make sense to have different fees penalizing corporate sector and users for making transaction in certain type of the day, a certain time or a certain day. Instead of it, we opted for a seamless fee using, I would say, the lower fee that was imposed a few years ago. So now we have the same fee across the whole day of working of our payment system, with the main message to the corporate sector and to the physical persons to do their transaction whenever they want, and not to be penalized when they will make a payment. As you may see, I have already explained, starting October 20th, we will opt for extended work of our payment system. And in addition to that, and that is an exercise that we are doing together, the Central Bank of Montenegro will be lowering its own fees on RTGS and DNS in the span between 20 to 50 million euros. That would possibly mean a loss, i.e. we will be deprived from our revenues in the amount of near 3.5 million euros, but this is the signal to the banking system. Once when we lower the tariffs, we are expecting that those tariffs are adjusted within the banking system towards the final user. We are sending the signal that the time of overcharging is far gone. We as a central bank, even without seigniorage, the core revenue of the central bank, are keen to opt to adjust our pricing just to cover our costs. And in that aspect, this is the message that we are sending to payment institutions, to credit institutions, and other participants in payment system. However, we are somewhere halfway. SEPA is there, new domestic payment system is there, but our crown, our end game, is implementation of TIPS cloned version of the original TIPS, together with overlay services, including QR code, potentially NFC payments, request to pay, and other features that will, I would say, assure reachability of payments in Montenegro. I will dare to say, given the yesterday's session that we had with Mr. Herreman and with the banks, which was a very, very fruitful one, that there is one more tweak and one more endeavor that is ahead of us as a medium-term goal, and that is by the mid of 2028 not to have two accounts, but just to have one IBAN account. In that aspect, it's a very, very long process. It assumes a lot of procedural and infrastructural adjustments, both on the side of the Central Bank of Montenegro and of the banks. However, given our EU perspective, it's worth it.
Absolutely. And this is something where actually the EU can learn from Montenegro when it comes to the Saturday and Sunday operations of the RTGS. This is something that we haven't yet implemented in the EU. The ECB, the European Central Bank, is currently in a consultation phase looking to do this. The Bank of England in the UK is looking to do something as well. So I think, it's not always Montenegro that's following EU, but here you're actually taking a step ahead, which is the benefit of businesses, that they can do payments whenever, receive payments whenever. It also means that businesses will need to think about reconciliation in the weekends. This is something that they'll have to do with TIPS clone in any case, but it impacts the way that corporates pay and reconcile their payments. Yeah, I think think you
Yes,
mentioned
I could just
the lower
read.
fees already, right? So let's talk about the most important topic, perhaps, instant payments, right? Perhaps you can give an introduction into why are we doing this? Why did we sign for a TIPS clone?
Yes, in our general strategy, as you may have already observed, our target was first to align our regulations to the EU acquis. Then our general thinking was why then to rely on, I would say, fragmented, isolated payment infrastructure. Why not opt for the EU-like infrastructure? And that is when we made a certain, I wouldn't say pressure, but constructive discussion with the ECB, with the idea if they could, I would say, create a TIPS version of instant payment for Western Balkan region. I already told you, and you have already seen how business-to-business corridors within Western Balkan region are extremely expensive. So, luckily, start on in June of 2024, we got a positive response from the ECB. Banca d'Italia took a role of the coordinator and offered to be the operator of the TIPS clone, i.e. instant payments for 5 markets within Western Balkan region: Albania, Kosovo, North Macedonia, Montenegro, Bosnia and Herzegovina.
So what are instant payments? Well, instant payments are governed by a scheme from the European Payments Council, so it's an EPC scheme. It allows us to do payments within 10 seconds, and in practice, if we're looking at Europe, most transactions, most instant payments are happening within 1 to 2 seconds, so it's actually much faster than that even. They're also available 24/7, so all days, Saturdays, Sundays, but also at nighttime and so on and so forth. What is the big benefit of these instant payments, and how are they different than RTGS payments? Because RTGS, real-time gross settlement, on RTGS payment is real-time in the interbank space, whereas instant payments are governed by this EPC rulebook, so are real-time from the perspective of the payer towards the beneficiary, who is instantly notified that the liquidity is available to them. That unlocks new use cases, right? We don't think about paying in a store with a credit transfer. That doesn't work because we don't have that certainty. We don't think about doing e-commerce using credit transfers. Again, you need that certainty that the funds will arrive. And that is exactly what we have with instant payments. It also means that corporates can think about their liquidity differently. They can move their liquidity around much faster, pay much later, have less liquidity in transit. So it unlocks quite a lot of trapped liquidity that's in that interbank space. If we look at the European adoption of instant payments, we're close to around, well, the latest figures are actually above 25% now of all payments that are being done as instant payments in Europe. That number will continue to increase, especially by October, when instant payments become mandatory for all banks to be able to send and receive across all channels. So that's the instant payments regulation, which has not yet been transposed in Montenegro, but at some point you can expect it will come. The other thing that's part of that instant payments regulation is that banks can no longer actually charge a surcharge when it comes to instant payments compared to regular credit transfers. So pricing regulation, it's not just here, it's also within the EU. You mentioned some of the key features. Anything else on this slide?
Yes, I believe that you are very much acquainted from, I would say, the press and general interactions of the central bank with the general public, how the TIPS clone will be working. It is a platform that assures even multi-currency instant payment transactions, because as you're very much aware that many countries within the Western Balkans are not using euro as their legal tender. In addition to that, the main role of the Banca d'Italia would be just to provide the infrastructure to assure the settlement, to provide the resilience in cybersecurity, and of course to be in charge for updates of the TIPS clone, i.e. each and every adjustment within original TIPS will be immediately transposed to the TIPS clone, meaning that Montenegro will be having the equal service, the equal standards as those within European Union. When it comes to central banks, Montenegro, when it comes to the role of the central bank of Montenegro, Of course, we'll be in charge of the oversight of the funding management of the banks, and in that regard, it is on our end to be fully aligned when it comes to payments directives, i.e. we need to keep up with the legislation adjustments in order to honor utilization of the TIPS clone. And when it comes to the main features, as Kjeld has already mentioned, 24/7, each and every transaction needs to be executed in a matter up to 10 seconds, and with future innovations, especially that will be developed together with TIPS clone, i.e. QR code, request to pay, and others, our general assumption is that this vehicle will help us on one end to assure reachability, to narrow the shadow economy, because we truly believe that this new infrastructure will help us to deal with the issue that we had at the moment related to the levels of merchant fees.
Absolutely. So, as I mentioned, Montenegro now being part of SEPA, it also means that financial institutions can become participants to the instant payment scheme, the EPC, the European Instant Payment Scheme. So potentially banks will offer two variants of instant payments, one domestic transactions, but potentially they could also integrate with TIPS at ECB level to use instant payments for cross-border transfers. At this time, banks can't become verification of pay participants. We'll come back to that in a second, but we're making work of that. So instant payments, it's a huge project for banks. I think a lot of banks here have started doing an initial assessment, and you can see that it touches all areas of the bank. It's an IT project. You need to have your core banking system that's available 24/7, that's highly responsive, it's low latency. That includes everything, your financial crime solutions as well that we see on the left side, and we have to work together with the market on a standardized approach when it comes to AML and fraud screening. Obviously, liquidity management, you'll get a taste of this already with the RTGS that'll be operating 7 days a week. But here, basically, it means that the liquidity of the bank can come in and out at any time. This is also very true for businesses, and certainly B2C businesses. We see that people start to do their payments in the weekend, typically. For example, if you have your telco and you need to pay your telco bill, you might as well do that in the weekend. So we'll start to see liquidity transfers then. In terms of operations, right now we have clients that can do payments at any time. What if that's even a high value payment and that payment gets stopped somewhere? Do we need to have customer service in place? We need to potentially have incident management in place 24/7. What's it mean from contractual, from our terms and conditions? And then finally, reporting. Our interbank reporting, our reconciliation, customer reporting notifications, but also client reporting. So now corporate customers who usually don't get transactions in on the Saturday and Sunday will have to at least receive that reporting on the weekends and be able to reconcile it. Right? Not reconciling those transactions is not an option.
Yes, maybe Kjeld, one question for you. I think it would be very relevant for the banks and the representatives of banks that we are having today. You already had the chance to talk with our banks and to be very much acquainted with their IT infrastructure, liquidity management structure, reporting, etc. So out of these 5 elements, i.e. prerequisites for efficient implementation of instant payment, and given that we are together in this process based at least on anecdotal evidence, of course the banks will be reporting us and we will get empirical evidence, where the banks in Montenegro is lacking the most.
So I think the biggest challenge is definitely on IT side, right? We're coming from a world where we're used to working on batch-based processes, on legacy systems. We didn't have to be available 24/7. I think this is quite different, right? Because you have to be highly available, you have to be real time. We see banks start to transition towards microservice-based architectures. So the IT change and the infrastructure that IT runs on is quite significant. That being said, there's a relative consolidation of the vendors in the Montenegrin market. So if they can follow along and get the projects done, then I think, you know, either it'll be a big success or a big failure in the market, very dependent on those vendors being capable of delivering. You hinted at it earlier, IBAN, right? So Montenegro is the only market I know of where we have this two-account system, where we have a BBAN for domestic transactions, IBAN for cross-border transactions. And the objective is to align with European standards, and that's to use an IBAN for everything. Now that's a huge challenge. We had this workshop that you referred to yesterday, right, where we talked about some of those challenges. It's not only a big IT challenge for banks to use these new references, but it also means businesses have to start using IBAN when they issue their invoices, when they pay, and so on and so forth, have to start using the IBAN. It's even ingrained in your legislation, so the payment systems regulation would have to be changed. Banks will have to rethink their customer contracts, potentially issue new cards because your BBAN is on the card. So it's a very big and ambitious project, but one that's absolutely essential for European alignment.
Yes, so, as a regulator, let's then sum up why we are doing all this. Of course, in our core mandate is to have efficient payment system. Nevertheless, the implication of the implementation of the efficient payments infrastructure are, I would say, multidimensional and multifaceted. And this morning, Governor has already pointed out, should SEPA and TIPS clone be implemented in a very, very, I would say, narrow span to which we are aiming for, we will be ending up with potential combined effects of additional 160 million euros, i.e. 2.3% of our GDP based on the estimates from 2023, which we took as a benchmark for the analysis. Whether through, I would say, savings within the system, savings B2B, remittances, enhancing resilience and sending a positive I would say, general impression toward the EU market and to credible investors. What that means in terms of EU convergence from the perspective of income, the Governor this morning pointed out that we are somewhere at around 50% of the EU average income. Implementing these two very important reforms have the potential to, over a decade, narrow the gap by more than 10%. So in that aspect, it is a very, very heavy burden and a task for especially banking system and us as a regulator to implement this reform in a, I would say, steadfast way, and to assure that together with the government we work that all these infrastructures are utilized in a manner to propel and push Montenegrin economy forward. In addition to, I would say, impact on general economy, what we want to achieve with TIPS in terms of, I would say, general reason why we are implementing it is really reachability. At the moment, around 75% of adults are having open bank account, out of which very similar ratio between men and women. Nevertheless, the women are using digital channels much, much less compared to their male peers. Only 64% of women, of those who have the account, are using digital channels. Only 59% are using compared to males, which is around 46%. Our aim is that by 2029, 85% of all payments within Montenegro should go digital. In addition to that, apart connecting our banks to the TIPS clone, our aim is to introduce PSP connected. We want to have it connected to TIPS. And in that aspect, what we want to do with, I would say, paper-based instruments, we want to lower it by 10 percentage points. These are very, very important tasks and very, very hard to achieve given where we are at the moment. However, one can tell that we are quite ambitious, and I believe with the synergy between banks, newcomers, fintechs, we can achieve this goal with the implementation of tips clone and, most importantly, overlay services. To this end, I believe this is the right moment to have our second poll. So apologies if we can have the question for the second poll. With SEPA now in place and instant payment coming in 2026, what new products and services would you most like to see banks and fintechs to develop? Yeah. QR code, request to pay, peer-to-peer.
While we're doing this poll, maybe a highlight of these type of value-added services that we typically see in markets, right? So the first value-added service that we see a lot is QR code payments. Why are they so important? Well, because a instant payment, it's a credit transfer. It's initiated by the payer rather than the beneficiary. Now, if we think about doing a payment at a store or e-commerce, that interaction is initiated by the beneficiary. And that QR code or a request to pay service allows for that transaction to be initiated by the payer, by the payee, pardon me, which is again allowing for the adoption of these new use cases. What are other services that we see certainly for the adoption of peer-to-peer transactions? Proxy databases are incredibly popular, and that will lead to a much wider adoption of digital payments. So what's a proxy database? A proxy database is basically just a database that is going to connect an account number to, for example, a phone number. So I can now authorize my banking app to access my contacts, and I can pay everyone in my contact list by only having their phone number. I don't have to see their account number, which is safety from a fraud perspective, but also a convenience perspective. Finally, we see fraud prevention solutions as valuable overlay service, and we'll look at those in just a second. Finally, and here's some good news for the banks as well, if we look at the EU as well as most markets, and if we look at World Bank data, instant payments are a category of their own, and we typically see that instant payments volumes don't necessarily cannibalize regular credit transfer volumes, but they are volumes that are addressed by these new use cases, by this increased efficiency. So there's a potential revenue pocket in this for banks as well. So not all just compliance, not all just we have to do it, but this is a significant revenue opportunity for banks as well.
Excellent. Well, it appears that QR code and peer-to-peer instant transfers appear to be, I would say, the prevalent choice. We as a regulator will take the note of this poll, given that we are in the process of creating a TOR for overlay services, and what we really want to do is to, I would say, implement those features that will benefit the most to clients in Montenegro.
Yeah. Shall we go to the last slide?
Yes.
Or second to last slide, there we go. Yes. So instant payments, great for users, all these new use cases, however, there are risks associated to it. What we see in Europe is that the rates of fraud associated to instant payments are much higher than for slower payments because the money instantly hits the beneficiary. So what do we see, for example, in the data from the UK? As faster payments started to become more and more the norm, we saw fraud rates spectacularly rising. What does that mean for banks? Well, I think we had a fantastic panel earlier talking about AI and the role of AI potentially in combating fraud. But banks will need to develop their fraud detection and their fraud prevention systems in order not to become hotspots for fraud. The last thing that we want is that fraudsters come to Montenegro to use these integrated European payments to become the money mules of Europe, right? As this is all new for us, and there's definitely a learning curve associated to it. So fraud prevention is critical. One of the last tools that we have is the verification of payee service. A verification of payee service allows the payer to verify the name that they enter in the payment against the name that's known by the beneficiary bank. This is specifically important for corporates that avoid, for example, invoice fraud. Now today, within the EPC, the way that this is constructed from a GDPR, from a data privacy compliance perspective, as well as a cybersecurity perspective, Montenegrin banks, or actually no non-EU banks, can be part of the scheme yet, but we are working closely with the European Payments Council to be able to accept European banks on this system.
Yes, so on the previous slide, I would like to add that definitely as a, I would say, newness for Montenegro, verification of pay is a very, very relevant question for our banks, and I believe that before the PPC, we already have the first topic to discuss, argue and lobby. So in that aspect, let me then finalize today's presentation by summing up once more where we are. For a small open economy, the window of integration cannot be missed. 2028 is just around the corner, and in that aspect, having an efficient interoperable system fully aligned with the EU acquis, with the features that resembles or are like within the EU, is the goal of Central Bank of Montenegro. If I could sum it up in one sentence, what we want by the end of 2026, Central Bank of Montenegro, together with Montenegrin banks, want to assure EU-like payment experience to Montenegrin citizens well before, i.e. 2 years before the entrance into the EU. I hope that you all will help us in that endeavor. Thank you very much.